Good evening, everyone. I'm David Suddjian, and welcome to Bird Bombs, helpful bursts of ID info. This is episode 27, Tropical Color. We're going to talk about the identification of orioles, tanagers, grosbeaks, and buntings. And I'm joined tonight by Laura Stedman, as usual, and she'll leap in later in the show for our Let It Fly segment. And if you have any questions or comments, do use our chat feature, and we'll have some time at the end to consider those. So everyone loves these birds, right? These are fantastic birds, so beautiful, so fun to watch. These are the sort of birds that are spark birds for people, those birds that get them into birding. In fact, I was just reading tonight or today in Hugh Kingery's updated Birding Colorado book, how his spark bird was the lazuli bunting. So there's a great Colorado birder who was sparked by the lazuli bunting. These birds are so beautiful, they inspire you to get into birding. And they also, even though the males are often somewhat easy to identify if you have a good look, the females and young males are a lot harder. So they present some good identification challenges. And Bird Bombs is up against Mick and the boys tonight. The Stones are playing at Empower Field in Denver. So thanks for sticking with Bird Bombs. It's not going to be as exciting perhaps as the Stones concert, but I tell you, it's going to be cheaper. And I think these birds look a little prettier than Mick and the boys do these days. Just saying, just saying. All right, so we are talking tonight about birds in the order Passeriformes, perching birds, and we're talking about birds in two different families. So that's a little unusual for bird bombs. I usually focus on a group of species that are all in the same family, but tonight we're sampling birds from the blackbird family, which includes the orioles, Icteridae, and from the family Cardinalidae, which is the cardinals, its namesake, and the Pyranga tanagers and allies. So some of these family groups you see the and allies thrown in there, and you know there you've got a variety of different sorts of birds that you're dealing with. So orioles, tanagers, grosbeaks, and buntings are our focus for tonight. And in fact, there are 18 different species in these groups that have been found in Colorado. Here they all are. Bird Bombs is going to take a focus on the Denver metro area and the Front Range counties, so kind of El Paso up to Larimer County and including the Denver metro area counties as well. So that means that a number of these species are definitely rare in that area, and I've highlighted them here. So the ones in yellow are the ones that are rare in our focal area. The others in white are much more regular. And some of these rarities are really quite rare in Colorado, like the varied bunting, yellow grosbeak, and streak-backed oriole, for example. And others are rare in our focal region, but are regular in other parts of the state. So even nesting. So you can find Scott's oriole, hepatic tanager, and painted bunting if you go to the right places. Those all have occurred rarely in our focal area, but we won't be dealing anymore with these rare species tonight. We're just going to focus in on our focal group. So one thing that's kind of interesting is we've got these birds called grosbeaks, but they're not all closely related, right? So here we have 5 different grosbeak species that occur regularly in Colorado, but they're in 4 different genera and even 2 different families. So the evening grosbeak and the pine grosbeak are not actually closely related to the other grosbeaks that we're going to be considering tonight. And we can see the blue grosbeak is in a different genus, Passerina, than the rose-breasted and the black-headed grosbeak in that genus Fucticus. So a little variety under a name. And we find a similar situation with buntings, where we have our species that we're looking at tonight, the indigo and lazuli, but there's also the lark bunting, which is not a bunting, it's a sparrow. There is the snow bunting, which is in with the longspurs, a different family. And then there are the old world buntings that have their own family. So a lot of variety. So what's in a name? Well, all I know is they're all great birds. All right, so here is our focal species. There are 10 of them. And here's the pictures of all of them on the right side of the screen. See how many you can identify, just kind of breezing through. I made it a little easier for you because they're not random, but they're kind of orderly on the page here. So that makes it easy. But see what you can get right off the bat. They're all the females, so making it a little bit harder for you. And I put notice they fall out into 2 groups. The ones in blue on the listing on the left are the ones that are common and regular in our focal area. The ones in yellow are generally rare in our focal area, but regular enough that you can go out and find them each year. Pretty much Baltimore Oriole, maybe not in our focal area, but if you look for it at the right places, follow up on eBird reports. So these other ones do occur, but they're a little bit rarer, and the ones in blue are regular friends. And you'll see that they occur in 4 different genera. We have the genus Icterus for the orioles, the tanagers in the genus Pyranga, the rose-breasted black-headed grosbeak in the genus Fucticus, and then our blue grosbeak in the 2 littler buntings in the genus Passerina. And here's a little key to the meaning of those genus names. I won't go into it now, but the one I really like is Fucticus painted with colors. I think that's really cool. And the lazuli buntings specific epithet amoena means pretty. So it's basically a pretty sparrow. I think that's pretty cool. We have the 4-letter codes listed there. They're all standard codes except for the lazuli bunting, which has a conflict with the lark bunting. So we have LAZB for that one. So that's the only one that's out of the ordinary. So these birds are all highly migratory species, vacate in Colorado with the exception of real rare wintertime occurrences and things. They vacate Colorado after migration and spend the time in subtropical and tropical Central and South America. And these species take 2 years for males to acquire full adult type plumage. Some of the males look a lot like the adult males in that second year, but some of them not. For example, the Bullock's oriole looks quite different than the adult male when it's just in its second year. And hybrids occur between these species. 2 of the species pairs have hybrids that are found regularly in Colorado, and you need to be thinking about that. We'll talk more about it later. The Bullocks and Baltimore Oriole and lazuli and indigo bunting are the most frequently noted hybrid pairs that we see here in Colorado, and they're not really that rare, particularly the Baltimore Oriole when you get out eastward is something you really need to be thinking about. These are all species that breed in Colorado, most of them nesting widely in the state. The rose-breasted, however, nests only rarely in the state with just a small number of breeding conformations for that one. So the first thing we always want to think about is status and distribution. So whenever we consider identification, status and distribution, the what, when, and where for each species takes up about 90% of the task of identification. So it's critical information to consider. And here we'll look at the timing here for a little bit. So we have eBird graphs from our focal Denver metro area and Front Range counties. This is showing frequency of occurrence on eBird checklists. So that's the percent of checklists that have the species recorded. And I have our 5 common species on this graph: the Bullock's oriole, western tanager, black-headed grosbeak, blue grosbeak, and lazuli bunting. And what we can notice right off the bat here is that they all have a spring peak. Well, all of them except for that blue grosbeak, which is the yellow line that's trending a little bit lower than the others. So it's less frequently encountered in a significant way than the other 4 species in our focal area. But we can see generally there's a decided spring peak of migration that's centered right in the second week of May, second, third week of May in that period, great time for migrating birds. And then there's a nesting period, and it's kind of a drop down in frequency from that migration peak, but the birds are present through the breeding season. Then they kind of taper off with post-nesting departure. And interestingly, for some of these birds, like the orioles, for example, they leave fairly early from their breeding areas, and they can be hard to find by the time you get into the later part of summer. And they go down to, some of them, go down to areas that are affected by monsoonal rain, such as in southeast Arizona and in northern Mexico in the Sierra Madre. And so there is a second season bloom of insects and things associated with those rains. So it's a great area for orioles and some other species to go during their molting time. So they have a lot of food to fuel that molting period after the nesting season. And most of these species show no fall peak. So there's no corresponding peak like the spring peak. Only the western tanager seems to have a little bit of a blip there, like a fall migration peak. So that's kind of interesting. And by the time you get to middle, end of September, they're mostly out of here. So we're right in the middle of this graph right now on our calendar. So let's consider how it's a little bit different out on the eastern prairie counties. Our focus is the Front Range and the metro area. But going east, we see that two of the species become a lot more prominent, the blue grosbeak and the Bullock's oriole, relative to the others. And the others are much less frequent. And during the summertime, the western tanager is even gone entirely from that area. But if we shift up to the nearby mountain counties, we can see that some of the birds that like the prairie or the foothill shrub type habitats, so blue grosbeak and lazuli bunting, have a pretty low presence up in the mountain counties that are close to the Front Range, while the other species are a little more regular there. And we see the western tanager and black-headed grosbeak really coming into their own up there into the mountains. So let's go back to the Front Range Denver metro area counties, and we'll compare our 5 common species that are our focal species that are on the left-hand graph. We already looked at that one. To the 5 rarer species. So on the right, we have the orchard oriole, Baltimore oriole, summer tanager, rose-breasted grosbeak, and indigo bunting. And we see a similar kind of overall pattern. But notice that the Baltimore oriole and summer tanager, so that's the green line and the red line here, are generally for much of the year a lot less frequent than these other species. And the orchard oriole and indigo bunting both have a nesting season presence in the Denver metro area Front Range counties. So we can see them present through the breeding season. So they're actually nesting in that area. The numbers are a lot lower. If you can read the numbers on the x-axis there, you'll see that the percents are about 2 orders of magnitude less for the rarer species than the more common species. So for example, the orchard oriole is peaking out at 1.6% frequency, while the Bullock's oriole is up there at over about 27%, 28% frequency. So some pretty different levels of occurrence there between these rarer and more common ones. But the rarer ones are indeed regular in the area we're talking about. The other thing that's kind of interesting, I just noticed this, is you can see how a rare bird can influence the graphs in eBird. So you'll notice the summer tanager, I was saying earlier how these birds don't occur during the winter, but rarely they do, and they found it feeders primarily. And here's a little green blip for summer tanager here in February into March. And this was largely from one bird that was in Arapahoe County that a lot of birders went to see. And it really affects the frequency chart when you have like an outstanding rarity that people go to see. So sometimes you want to keep that in mind when you're evaluating things. So we'll continue on here and we'll consider our first of the focal species, the Bullock's oriole. And we're going to start with our pretty boys. And aren't these guys gorgeous? I just love the Bullock's oriole. They have so much attitude. I love their song. It sounds so comical and fun. And they are just so flashy when you see them. They just glow up there in the trees. Now, the identification is relatively easy when you get a good look. We see the things that kind of stand out for us here that are distinctive to notice for the Bullock's oriole. The males have a black eye line and a black goatee. So I'm calling that black area down the throat a goatee because it's kind of narrow down the center part of the chin and the throat. So distinctive face pattern there for the Bullock's oriole. And notice that orange supercilium and cheek, okay? And there's one big wing bar. It's kind of a fusion of different little feather tracks there, and you have one big bar on the secondary coverts. And then there are a lot of white highlights on the edges of the tertials and secondaries, and even that's these. So if you look at the flying bird, you can see the tertials back here, secondaries with all that white, even a little bit of white on the primaries there. And on the folded wing, it translates to that. We'll see kind of how that plays out again with the different species, but a lot of white on the wing. Another thing that kind of we don't notice so much, but is a useful feature relative to the Baltimore oriole, or when considering hybrids, is that there's black across the tip of the tail for the Bullock's oriole. So they've got black out there, maybe not a whole lot on the outer feathers, but a little bit of black going out across the tail on the Bullock's oriole. Usually we're so wow looking at all these other features, we may not even notice that, or we just see the big black down the center of the tail. But black at the tips of the tail is a good feature to be aware of. So we're sticking with the pretty boys here. Now we're going to bring in the Baltimore oriole in the middle and the 3 images of the orchard oriole over there on the right side of the screen. We've got the Bullock's oriole male still up on the left for some comparison. We can see the Baltimore and the Bullock's basically follow a similar pattern as does the orchard oriole when you get down to it. But there are differences. So the Baltimore Oriole compared to the bullocks, look at the head. Seems strikingly different, right? So the Baltimore is all black on the head, whereas the bullocks has that face pattern with the supercilium and eye line. And instead of a big white wing bar on the Baltimore, it has a big orange wing bar. It's usually a richer color, more orange tone than the Bullock's Oriole, which is a little trending more toward a brighter yellower tone orange. But some of the Baltimore Orioles are indeed more yellowy, as you can see on the lower bird here at the center is more of a yellow color. So there's some variation. And there also is um, some no black on the tips of those tail feathers. Here's a nice flying shot there by Gary Witt, and you can see those outer tail feathers have no black on them. So that's an interesting mark to be aware of, as I was saying. So Baltimore Oriole. And then what about the small Oriole there on the right? I'm even marked as a small Oriole because the Orchard Oriole is indeed much smaller than the other two. The Baltimore is a little bit smaller than the Bullocks, but they look pretty close. The Orchard Oriole, though, is about 2 inches littler, and it really sometimes can recall a big warbler, particularly the females. And if you see one kind of when you're not expecting it, then that sometimes you can get fooled even by that. So a lot smaller overall size and a much shorter, smaller, more compact bill. And of course, the male Orchard Oriole, adult male, has this beautiful chestnut body coloration and chestnut wing bar, which is unique and distinctive and gives it away right away. And its tail is all black. So our pretty boy is not too challenging, really, when you get a decent look. You know, that's always the thing, right? Sometimes you don't have a decent look, so you want to consider what your possibilities are to look at. But let's consider the drabber ones now. So first we have our Bullock's Oriole, and we have some females across the top and immature males across the bottom. And let's focus on the females here first. And we'll notice that the Bullock's Oriole female is yellow at the ends and gray in the middle. So it has yellow in the head breast region and yellow on the tail, and the undertail covers rump area a little bit, but it's gray on the body and on the upper part. So you've got that kind of yellow, gray, yellow pattern, which is good to look for on a female Oriole. The back is grayish and kind of streaked or marked with some kind of spotted patterns. It has a upper wing bar that is bolder, just like on the Bullocks Oriole, you have that one big bold wing bar. The female Oriole sometimes shows kind of almost two wing bars, but it also has the top one is the one that's much more obvious and kind of broader. So again, kind of mirroring the pattern of the adult male there a little bit. And one thing we want to notice when looking at the female bullocks is that where is its brightest color? We're going to see the color is brightest on the malar area or the cheek. And so that's where you're going to find the brightest color. It's going to be different usually on the Baltimore Oriole. And the female bullocks, depending on lighting and all that, has a suggestion of the male's head pattern. There's a little bit of an eye line, supercilium, and a darker crown. And indeed, notice the crown and the cheek are in contrast. So the crown's a little dusky and dark. The cheek is yellow. So you have some color contrast there and helpful features on the female bullocks. Now, the young male bullocks has a goatee, kind of like the adult male bullocks, but its coloration is different and it has more of the female body pattern with yellow at the ends and gray in the middle. It's a little brighter generally than the female Oriole, and it has that little black on the throat to give you away. So these are birds in their 1 year old. Okay, so when we see some of the Orioles this time of year, they look like the adult males. Some of the males are this 1 year old birds that are in basically into their coming to the close of their entering into their 2nd year of life pretty soon here, or about this time. So they've got that black goatee and eye line after they go through a molt. So when the fledgling juveniles come out, they're going to look like drab females. And then by the time they molt, which is out of our area, they acquire that goatee. And when we see them back again in the spring, we have them with the goatee. Okay, so let's bring in the Baltimore and Orchard Orioles here for a little comparison. So we still have our female bullocks up on the left there. And we can go right to the Baltimore in the middle. So we've got three Baltimore Oriole pictures in the center and lower left, and 3 Orchard Oriole pictures over on the right side. A little more challenge finding some good images of the Baltimore, so I don't have quite as much to work with, but what you can see from these is they're much more yellow or warm colored overall than the bullocks. They don't have the yellow, gray, yellow pattern, yellow front, gray middle, yellow tail, but instead they're kind of yellowish throughout. And in fact, often the color tone is a little more orangey. And so more extensively colored there. And the brightest color on the Baltimore Orioles, not going to be on the malar cheek area like on the bullocks. Remember, that was up here on the left-hand image. But on the Baltimore, the brightest area is usually on the breast. Okay. And they don't generally show as much of a contrast from the side of the head to the crown as the Bullock's Oriole does. But you got to be aware of the fact that the female Baltimore Oriole is quite variable in body coloration. So some are going to look a little bit more like the Bullocks in overall coloration. Some are going to be decidedly richer toned and orangey and more extensively colored. Some females even have a fair amount of blackish on the head. So want to be aware that there is a lot of variety there for the female Baltimore Oriole. What about that orchard? So we're still aware that it's much smaller than the other two species, and it is kind of yellow-green overall. So it doesn't really have the same color tone as the other two species. It's more of a yellow-green, and it also is more extensively colored underneath, as you can see in these images. The female is very plain-faced, a little bit of an eyeline showing there, but notice the very small bill and kind of small impression that she gives. And indeed, the female's even a little bit smaller than the male, so it really stands out. The young male is kind of like that Bullock's young males we saw with the goatee, but it's not like a goatee so much because it's much broader across the throat and extends up onto the face and laurel area more so than in the Bullock's Oriole. In fact, a lot of times the young male orchard oriole can recall a young male hooded oriole, which is a little bigger bird, bigger bill. We're not going to get into the hooded oriole ID tonight, but it's an important consideration. If you ever think you have a hooded oriole, you want to very carefully evaluate the orchard oriole possibility. Orchard, of course, much more likely in Colorado, and it is a tricky identification. And here in Colorado, it's the opposite of where I started. So when I was in California, the orchard is a rarity and the hooded is regular, and you kind of wonder what you have with the orchard. And here in Colorado, it's the other way around. The hooded is a rarity, and you kind of wonder, do I have one? Now, of course, the adult males are different, but we're not talking about that right now, right? So here's our female orioles and immature males. Ah, wow. Every time I look at this slide, it just knocks me off my seat. Woo! I'm not going to fall down literally, but these guys are just stunning. Here we have our two tanagers, the Western tanager on the left and down in the middle here a little bit, and three images of the summer tanager. And aren't these pretty boys indeed? Now, of course, the identification of these is often obvious, provided you have a decent look, but we don't always have decent looks. But they're pretty straightforward. The Western, we can note that it's a yellow, black, and red bird. Sometimes we just see it flying by. We see the red head, yellow body, black wings and tail, yellow, black, and red. The summer tanager, all red as an adult male. And the notice on the Western tanager, the two wing bars, but they're different colors. The upper wing bar is yellow. The lower one is white. And there on the Western tanager, there's a fair amount of variation in the amount of reddish or sometimes it's orange color that you see on the head. And some of that relates to the age of the bird. So younger males apparently are more lightly marked than the adult males. I'm not just talking about a first spring male, like I believe the one on the center right is here, a bird in its first spring without very much red. But even the more adult males can vary quite a bit in the amount of red that's showing on the head. So just kind of be aware of that. Summer tanager, of course, all red. It's a bigger tanager than the Western by a little bit with a bigger bill. Those are obvious when you get a decent look and you're used to the Western, you can see that bigger size features. And notice that the summer tanager often has a crested look on the crown. This is helpful when you have a poor lighting view, and it also will raise its tail a little bit as it's doing its thing, and that is hold its tail cocked up a little bit, and that's different than the Western and can be a good kind of silhouette type feature that you can notice. So these guys, gorgeous, but not too challenging for our ID. Love it. I just don't want to go forward because I love looking at these. But onward we go to the drabber females. And Actually, I got a first-year male on this one as well, and immature male there for the summer. So we've got it broken down the same way. Western tanagers on the left, summer tanagers on the right. And we can still apply those same features of the larger size and bigger bill for the summer tanager, its crested look and its tail positioning. But as we consider the Western, we notice it has a gray back, contrasting gray back, kind of like a gray saddle almost. And the young males in their first spring have some reddish on the head, but it's usually pretty subdued, as in this example here in the center. Now, pretty soon we're going to be looking at juvenile Western tanagers. I don't think they're out of the nest quite yet, but they will be shortly. And they can be quite drab. I included one here from an image taken, I think it was late July or early August, and they can be quite kind of grayish looking and not very much yellowish at all. Still look like a tanager. Notice tanagers have a more stout beak than, say, the oriole, which is a finer, more pointed beak. Tanager bill is a little bit thicker looking, so you see that tanager bill still there on the juvenile, but it is much drabber. Now, when the Western tanager gets to the later part of well into summer here, the red starts to go away. So they begin their pre-basic molt, and they're going to look like females a lot more by the time we get to September. And it seems like a lot of the males have already departed from our area. And when you get into September, for example, you're still seeing tanagers, or even late August, you're mostly seeing, or almost entirely seeing, female type birds. Which may include some males that have already molted, or maybe the males have taken off. So there's kind of a seasonal shift there, making it a little more challenging even in late summer because we don't have the bright males showing off as much. So the body plumage is still brighter on the basic plumage adult male Western tanager than on the female, but it doesn't have the red on the head. So in considering the summer tanager, we'll notice that the Western has these obvious wing bars, that the summer tanager is kind of more or less all one color, a little duskier on the flight feather areas. It does not have obvious wing bars. It often has a warmer coloration than the Western tanager, sometimes kind of orangey in tone, as you can see, especially on the bird on the upper right, or kind of pinkish even, and is kind of evenly colored in that way. So you don't see distinct splotches of red coloration or pink on the female tanager, but it's kind of evenly blended like watercolor that's been washed together. Now, the immature male summer tanager can have distinct splotches of red and sometimes can be very just striking red and yellow blotchy pattern, or sometimes a little more subdued, but different than the female where it's kind of blended in together. All right, so we took a little tour through our tanagers. Now we're going to move on to our big grosbeaks in the genus Fuchsicus. We have our black-headed on the left and rose-breasted on the right. Again, the identification is usually pretty straightforward, given a decent look. We can notice on the black-headed grosbeak that it has a bicolored bill. The upper mandible is darker than the lower mandible. It's pretty consistent. Versus the rose-breasted grosbeak, the mandibles are both basically the same color, and they're usually pretty pale looking, kind of whitish or horn colored. They're on the rose-breasted. So a different bill pattern and coloration. And sometimes the rose-breasted is very black-headed, like the one at the top right. Other times it can have various speckles of white on that black. And some of the younger males that are 2 years old and older may have more white there than some of the older males, which may be all just solidly black. One of the distinctive things about these two grosbeaks is they have different colors on the underwing coverts. Now, we don't see that so much unless a bird flies over us or we're watching for it especially. So I challenge you in the field over the coming weeks or whenever to try to see the underwing color on a grosbeak. It actually can be a helpful ID point for immature male rose-breasteds, which are pink on the underwing, but the black-headed has yellow on the underwings, both males, adult males and females, and the rose-breasted has a pink underwing. Now, the female rose-breasted is yellow on the underwing like the black-headed, so that's not going to help you with the females, but it will help you with immature male rose-breasted grosbeak, which look a lot like females. So we'll just be aware of that. I don't have a picture of an immature male rose-breasted showing its underwing. Beautiful birds. Now, notice on this black-headed grosbeak, there's a lot going on with that white on the upper parts. It looks really complex. And if you were, you had to describe where the white is on the bird, you might be hard pressed to kind of make sense of it. So it's kind of interesting to consider just where is that white, and it'll help us have a little lesson on feather tracks again. So if you're not familiar with the different parts of the bird and the different feather tracks, it's really good as a birder to get familiar. I have a bird bomb from February 2023 called Where's That on the Bird? And it's in our Bird Bombs library on the DFO page, and you can learn all about the different feather tracks and parts of the bird. I really recommend that. But let's take a look at these two pictures. We have this nice flying image by Melody in the center here, and the one on the upper left that we'll use for our lesson. Look on the flying bird, the wing is open, and we can see more clearly where all that white is located. So we have three sets of flight feathers on the wing. There are the tertials, which are the innermost three feathers in this case, the secondaries, all with white tips, and then a set of 9 primaries without white tips. But the primaries have a big white bar across their base area. And then we see some other white here on the upper part of the wing. So these are all flight feathers. And then we have secondary coverts. Okay, so these are covering over the secondaries. And we see white tips on the greater secondary coverts and white on the median secondary coverts. So let's look up on the upper left now. We can see how that plays out. So when the wing closes, the flight feathers, the primaries fold underneath the secondaries, which fold underneath the tertials. So they all lay on top of each other. Tertials on top. Where's my mouse? Tertials on top. Little white spots here. They're different lengths, positioned differently on the wing. And then here's a row of tips from the white secondaries. So that's these white tips that we see down here on the flying bird. And then we can see that white bar that we see in the primaries on the open wing is showing that other big white patch on top. And here's the secondary coverts showing the one wing bar on the tips of the greater secondary coverts, and this white area on the median secondary coverts. And then there's various white markings on the scapular area here on the sides of the wing. So this is actually part of the upper parts, not part of the wing. All right, so kind of fun to consider where that white is. All right, so there were those males. They're pretty easy. It gets a lot more challenging with the female grosbeaks and the immature male grosbeaks. So we mostly see the black-headed grosbeak. We've got black-headeds on the left side here, rose-breasteds on the right. Again, we can bring into play the bill color. We can see that the black-headed has a bicolored bill. The rose-breasted, usually has a single color bill, a one-color bill. The black-headed has this nice warm color across the breast. You can even see a little yellow, I think, from the underwing coverts peeking out right there, maybe, but has a nice wash of warm orangey across the breast, and usually not very many streaks. It's usually a pretty clear breast with just some fine streaks along the sides of the breast and none across the center of the breast. Let's contrast that with our female rose-breasted over on the right. It's a whiter breasted bird with more coarse streaking and streaking going right across the center of the breast. So that's a really good feature. Now, one thing you want to be aware of in terms of the color is that on the black-headed, that nice warm tone fades out to a much more of a light wash of color as we get into summer. So those feathers wear and the color wears to a paler tone. So you won't be seeing such bright birds later in the summer unless you're dealing with the juveniles, which all of a sudden are quite bright and strongly patterned on the head like this one in the center. So let's say by the time you get to late July or into July, you're probably looking at females looking like this without much color, and the juveniles all of a sudden very bright color. Now they're often begging, they have distinctive call notes, other things to give them away. Kind of be aware if that color difference occurs seasonally. So back to our contrast between the two species. We still have on that first spring male, which I don't have one in flight, he would have the pink under the wing. And on a juvenile male, you're also going to have pink under the wing should you have a juvenile male up here. But let's notice the streaking on the breast, streaking, the coarseness of it, how it comes across the middle. Another feature that's a little different is that the black-headed grosbeak is kind of buff colored here on the nape area, whereas the rose-breasted is not. So some good features there to look at on those two birds. And now we're in the blue boys here. So pretty boys We've got our three passerina species, blue grosbeak on the left, lazuli bunting in the middle, and indigo bunting over on the right. Now, the blue grosbeak is, even though it's in the same genus, it's bigger than the two buntings. It has a bigger bill, and it's a darker blue. So it has a larger size, a darker blue, bigger bill. Notice they have black on the front of the face. The indigo bunting has a suggestion of black there, but often the blue grosbeak is a little distinctive patch there of black. And it often shows a crested head profile. The buntings, littler buntings tend to be kind of round-headed, whereas the blue grosbeak often shows a bit of a cresty profile, kind of like the summer tanager did. And that can be helpful when you get one in poor light. And it seems like not too infrequently, these guys are perched up maybe against the sun, and you can't see some of the details as well. Notice also the blue grosbeak has these nice rusty wing bars. So whereas the indigo male is basically all blue, the blue grosbeak has this patch of color on the wing with these rusty wing bars. And sometimes when you get the bird even though you don't have it, say, backlit by the sun, it can sometimes look quite dark and blackish looking, like this one that's singing here in the lower right example of our blue grosbeaks. So sometimes can appear very dark. And you can see well on this bird on the underside of the tail that the outer tail feathers are a good bit shorter than the middle tail feathers. So when this bird has its tail open, it has a nice rounded look to the tail. And you can even appreciate that viewing the underside versus the tail on the little buntings. The feathers are all similarly length, or even the outer feathers might even be a little bit longer than the middle feathers. So different tail shapes. So let's move to our buntings. And first thing we have to consider is the eternal question of how to pronounce the name of this bird in the middle of the page. This comes up again and again on field trips. They say the bird's name and they're not sure if they're pronouncing it right, so they ask. And here's the deal. It's lazuli, lazuli bunting, lazuli bunting, lazuli bunting. So it's not lazuli, lazuli with the accent on the zoo, and it's not lazuli. Those are incorrect pronunciations, and I verified this with a internet check. So lazuli bunting is how we're going to pronounce that. And Merlin also gives us a challenge because it is routinely misidentifying singing lazuli buntings as indigo buntings. Happens all the time. The same bird, it will identify as both species. So you want to be completely wary when eBird tells you you have an indigo bunting and you want to track it down with a visual. My actual experience is that a lot of the indigo buntings I've seen or heard in our areas have a song that's pretty different from our local lazuli songs, but apparently the issue comes up because the two species do share songs, and we're in that zone of overlap between the two species, the indigo primarily eastern, lazuli primarily western. And so Merlin will give you some challenges there, so just be aware. So let's consider our other ID points. The lazuli is a blue, orange, and white bird. The indigo is basically all blue. Notice it actually has some blackish dark area near the front of the face and a little blackish tones on the flight feathers, the wings and the tail. But basically it's an all blue bird. The lazuli has two wing bars, two white wing bars. The upper one is bolder. You can see on the top center picture. And the indigo bunting doesn't have any wing bars showing, or if it does, if you get the impression of them, they're blue wing bars that really aren't contrasting. You can pick that up a little bit on the top center bird there. So the darkest head on the darkest blue should be on the head for an indigo bunting. So a little different kind of color pattern there. Beautiful, beautiful birds. So these guys aren't terribly hard, but these ones are. So here we have in this case, just females. I don't think any immature males here, just females. We got same arrangement, blue grosbeak left, lazuli in the middle, indigo on the right. And one thing we can notice if we look carefully at most of these pictures, we can pick out a blue cast in different areas on the bird. And these passerina birds species have blue in the upper tail coverts and tail, and usually on the wings, on the lesser coverts here, lesser secondary coverts way up near the shoulder area, you'll see little blue tones if you look closely. It's kind of fun to try to pick that out next time you see one of these generally brown birds, to try to pick out the blue coloration. So the lazuli is a much more warmly toned bird, I think, than the indigo bunting. And notice it has a nice kind of wash of warm buff across the throat, and there's no streaks. If you discern any streaks, it's like you really got to be looking hard and you're really honing in there to see little tiny fine streaks versus the more distinct streaking, still not really strong and pronounced like on, say, a rose-breasted grosbeak female, but more distinct streaking that will catch your eye. So we have a breast with a warm buff wash, and here we have a breast without the buff wash, but with the streaks. And notice that the throat area on the female lazuli, pretty much the same color as the breast. Not a contrast there, whereas on the indigo bunting, the throat is whitish in contrast with a somewhat more brown breast. So some really good features to kind of hone in on. And that's pretty much what's going to get you there on these two female buntings, is looking at the breast coloration and patterning. Now, the challenge is for a juvenile lazuli bunting, like out of the nest juvenile, they're streaked under. Usually a little more obviously, I think, even than the indigo bunting, but they're streaky for a little while until they undergo their formative preformative molt later in the summer. So a little bit of a caution there dealing with a juvenile lazuli bunting, and a lot of times they're maybe accompanied with a parent, which will kind of help you figure out your identification. I like this image of the male flying up, and you can appreciate on this female indigo that whitish throat contrasting with the streaked, more brownish colored breast. All right, so now we've got immature and non-breeding males here. So when the buntings and blue grosbeak leave us here in Colorado, after that time, the males molt, and the males still have a lot of the, I'm looking, say, for example, the lazuli image in the center here, they still have a lot of the same coloration, but some of their feathers are kind of brownish. And that brown later, as we get into spring, will wear off and reveal the blue. But when some of the buntings arrive in late April and early May, they still may be showing a fair amount of brownish coloration on the head and on the back, but showing a lot of other blue and the orderly orange on the breast and white underneath. So that's a good clue of kind of the non-breeding features of the male. The non-breeding male blue grosbeak on the left has those pale tips as well, and they're going to wear away and reveal the all blue. Now the immature first spring males that you'll see sometimes are kind of blotchy with color. So they don't look, they look like they're kind of messed up. And you can see some of these blue grosbeaks on the left may have just total blotches of blue out here on the underparts and patchy blue on the head, or it may have a blue head and a brown body. So kind of weird looking when you first see them. Or on the lazuli and indigo buntings, the same thing, kind of splotchy with blue, but not even near the pattern of the non-breeding males, which are much more the typical coloration. So there we have our non-breeding males and young males for our Passerina species. All right, so let's come back. We're going to drop the H-bomb here. Hybrid time. We're only going to look briefly at two of the combinations. These are the two that I said were the most frequent in Colorado: the Baltimore Bullocks hybrid and the indigo lazuli hybrid. I just saw a hybrid indigo lazuli just about a week ago down in Huerfano County, and just after seeing a normal adult male indigo. So there they were, basically in the same spot. But what you're looking for are intermediate features. So the color patterns are not going to add up to what they ought to. On the oriole, you're looking for intermediate pattern on the head, wings, and tail tip. All right, so you can go back and review the video if you need to remember what the normal patterns are in there, but you'll see instead of one big white bar, here we've got an orange bar and a bunch of white. We see splotches of yellow or orange rather in the head, and can't really see, we can even see some black out on the outer tail feathers here on this hybrid, showing us kind of an interbreed between Baltimore and Bullocks. Now, some of them look a lot more like one or the other. And especially if you think you have a Baltimore Oriole male, you want to look really carefully at it to make sure you don't have bird that with some hybrid features. With the indigo lazuli, it basically tends to look more like an indigo bunting with pale underparts and often pale wing bars. So different from the pattern of either of the adults, but sharing some features from both. All right. So that was our tour through our focal species. We're going to go to our Let It Fly segment here. I'm going to invite Laura to come on and join me. Let's get pictures, good. And Laura, you don't have your there now. You're unmuted. There you are. So as usual, we want to do a little review, and we're going to put you on the hot seat here and get to consider for us what you think we're looking at. So isn't this a fun picture? We've got a really cool mix of birds. This happened to be from the location in Huerfano County where the state's first record of yellow grosbeak showed up, and it was in with the same mix of these ones. I left that one out because we're not focusing on that, but what do you think we have here?
Oh gosh. Okay, so you've
Can't hear you
numbered.
very well.
Yeah. Oh,
Oh,
you
that's
can't
because
hear
I don't have
me.
my headphones on. There we go. Sorry. Go for it.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, yes, that was my
Okay,
phone.
sweet, sweet. So you've counted the birds for me, so that's a great start. We've got 5 birds um to look at here. So the first thing that jumps out at me is that bluebird in the front. So starting at number 4,
Okay.
that blue really jumps out at me, and I see the brown on the wing. I see that kind of blocky bill. So we've already narrowed it down with the blue to one of the 3 that we just talked about. The brown on the wing, the blocky bill, and the dark on the face. That tells me it's a blue grosbeak.
All right.
Let's jump back to number 1. Number 1, I see orange, I see black, I see white. It's facing away from us, so that's not, we can't really see the face of the bird so well, but I do see a gray beak. Um, uh, it's hard to kind of tell, like we mentioned, the black headed grosbeak has the bicolor bill, a little bit darker on the top. I can't quite tell. I can kind of imagine that.
I
I
think
see
I
black
see it a
on.
little bit.
Yeah, yeah. Like if it moved around for a minute,
Uh-huh.
maybe we could determine if that's really a thing or if just a photo fragment. I see dark on the head, I see orange, I see the white kind of in those places that we talked about on the back of the wings. So I'm calling that a male black-headed grosbeak.
Right.
Um, n- Number 2 is a funky one. I see a black head and I see orange, but it's a little bit paler than number 1, and I see black on the back and less white, but still a little bit of white. Um, so part of me wants to call that a black-headed grosbeak too. What
It
else
does
could
look
it?
a lot like number one. It's
It
just
looks
what's
a
it's just
Yeah,
this individual is showing less white on the upper parts or less of the pale markings on the back and
yeah.
things. But we have a different angle too, which so for the wings certainly we don't have a very advantageous angle. Of course, it'd be obvious if the bird was in life and moving around. You'd say, "Oh," but I think you're on the right track there,
Okay.
black-headed grosbeak.
Yeah, yeah. I'm trying to like kind of mentally rule out everything else, but like from this vantage point, it looks like a black-headed grosbeak to
Well, it's
me.
not an oriole, right? Because
Yeah,
the bill, we can
right.
tell the bill doesn't look right, and
It is a big
overall some
chunky
problems.
bill.
Yeah. So,
Yeah, yeah. It is a gross beak, a big beak.
what do you think about
Um,
number 3 and 5?
yeah, number 3 and 5. So number 3, that strikes me as like a female bird probably. Again, that big gross beak, that big bill. And it's a very cool toned bird. So I'm thinking female, and my options feel like black-headed grosbeak female or rose-breasted grosbeak female. And we talked about how the female black-headed grosbeaks tend to have a little bit more warm coloration. They lack the streaking. And so to me, number 3 is probably a rose-breasted grosbeak.
Right. And you were talking before about the bill color when you were looking at number 1 on the male. Here you can see the bill a lot better. You can
Yeah,
see
that's true.
it's all one color.
Yeah.
So both that, I think you're right, the underpart patterning color and then with that bill color are good features.
Yeah. And then the number 5 on the back there, I see warm tones and I see a little bit of blue around that eye. Um, And so that puts me back into the blue grosbeak, lazuli bunting, indigo bunting category. So which one of those three is it? I'm leaning lazuli bunting on that because there's kind of a warmness, and that blue is like hinting at like a, a, a warmer, more cerulean teal blue than
Now let me challenge you on this a little bit. So
okay, yeah, maybe I'm
one
wrong.
question is, does it look especially small? Like that's a really small, it's smaller than the
Hmm.
others, I agree, but maybe not smaller than number four.
Yeah, it's tricky to tell. Like
Okay, it is
maybe it's
tricky to
not
tell.
that
Well, what
far
else?
back
What else?
away.
Notice the head pattern, a head shape is kind of peaked or crested
It
a
is
little
kind
bit
of
here,
peaked.
right? And then I
Yeah.
see over on the side here a little bit of color on the wing bars that's kind of a brown, if anything, kind
Hmm.
of a rusty tone. So I'm gonna say I don't know about first, and then
Yeah.
also I hate to do it, but I'm gonna challenge you on your pronunciation of lazuli. So you're saying
Oh gosh,
lazuli,
it's so
and
hard.
the buzzer's going off. Uh-oh. No, it doesn't matter how you say it. We all know what it means. Just say Laz Bunting, and then we're all gonna be.
But
So, yeah, I think we have a blue grosbeak
a
here,
blue grosbeak. Okay,
a
nice.
female blue, but they can be tricky. They can be tricky, definitely. Even though a lot of the times the blue grosbeak is clearly bigger and has some differences. In this view, we're a little more challenged.
For
So
sure.
cool. Good job. Good
Well,
job. Let's
nice.
go on to another image here. Uh-oh, here we're not even seeing the
Uh-oh, it
whole
lost its
bird.
head.
Yeah, it looks like we got it in a golden currant shrub here,
Yeah.
and I even think I even see a little berry right there.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, yeah.
so what do you think we have here?
Yeah, so with this bird, I see kind of yellow on the tail. I see some white gray in the midsection and the hint of more yellow on the front. And I see kind of those gray wings. My first inclination with this, I see a little bit of kind of white on the wing and kind of a wing barish format, but it's not really very bold. So with this one, I'm leaning female Bullock's Oriole.
And here it's made itself a little more visible, so now we can see the head more clearly,
There
and
we go.
and we probably feel a little more comfortable. Even now, we can see that kind of bright malar area and a little bit of a head pattern showing
Yeah.
that we see on the female bullock. So great job. That's a little bit tricky. Here's another kind of drab one.
Okay.
Great
Yeah.
view in a way. But
Yeah. Yeah. And so nice in comparison to the last one, this bill looks very different to me. So that's
let
kind
me
of the
just go
thing.
back to that and see. We can see the bill
Yeah.
real well, but it looked kind of narrow and pointed.
Narrow, it's
Different
gray, it's
colors too. Yeah.
pencil lead, and this one is like orange and kind of thick and funky. Um, so to me, that puts this one not in the Oriole category, but in the tanager category. I'm starting to think tanagers. Um, and I see that kind of greenish head. We can't see any wing bars on the top. Um, I'm seeing kind of olivey to yellow all the way underneath, a little bit of white underneath the tail there, but it's still kind of yellowy.
Right.
My default inclination, if we're out here in Colorado, my default, the first option is Western Tanager.
Always
Um,
good to be aware of those defaults and use those
right.
reference species for sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
So
Western tanager, you think?
that's kind of what I'm thinking, unless I saw
Yeah.
that bill and it looked like the Scarlet Summer Tanager has like a, I don't know, a bigger bill to me.
Bigger bill, usually kind of a paler look to the bill. And often, so the summer tanager, we might expect to be a different color as well. So probably a little
Sure.
richer
Yeah,
color
yeah.
tone, more towards the orangey end of the spectrum than the Western. But they do vary. And some female summers are kind of yellowish, but they tend to be a little more of a dull yellow, greenish yellow
Mhm.
compared to the Western tanager, a more yellowish, greenish yellow. So that's cool. And one thing I wanted to mention before we leave this one, you got it correct, um, is with the tanagers. So we have the tanagers that we're talking about tonight in this family cardinality with the cardinal and the grosbeaks and the buntings. And these tanagers we have in North America are all in the genus Pyringa. But until not terribly long ago, they were all in a different family, which is now a separate family called the Thraupidi, the tropical tanagers. So it's a gigantic family of like 350 50 rough species that are all tropical uh, in occurrence and don't range up here into our part of the world. So our tanagers are not related to most of the world's tanagers, which are in a whole other family. Same name, but there we go. So that's kind of cool. So
Yeah.
let's do something a little different. So all these birds we've been talking about are things that we're going to see when we're out in the field, usually up in trees or in bushes, in cover, places where they're not necessarily obvious where they are. And you're out there in the field and somebody's got the tanager, oh, it's up there in the green tree. Well, that's not very helpful, right? So let's talk a little bit about how we can get people onto a bird that we see if we're birding with others. And we'll just run with this with a few examples. So on these pictures, I put the bird location with a little reddish blob, kind of help us know where we're trying to describe. And here we've got a whole bunch of trees. And one thing that's not very helpful is to say it's straight out in front of me, because obviously if you're looking at it, it's going to be straight out in front of you. And where you are is not a good reference point. So we'll leave that behind right away. But what might you do to describe this? Maybe you have a
Gosh.
tanager up there, and it may not be easy to see with the naked eye. So you can't get on it right away just by kind of pointing. So you have to describe. And remember that you're in a
Yeah.
group of 6, 7 people, and they're spread out left and right. They don't all have the same viewing angle as you do either. What would you
Yeah,
say?
yeah. For sure. And like the angle that people are looking at is super important to think about, especially when you've got a big group of folks. And so when I'm trying to point out a bird kind of in the middle of the trees, it's up there in the trees, right? Is look for what's really unique. And it may not even be exactly near the thing, but on
Mhm.
the ground, or maybe it's a tree or two to the left that I can describe to get people centered on a specific point.
Great.
So for this one, I might say like so there's a couple of options that I might try depending on how like quick people are to pick up on things. But one thing I see is that there's a tree on the left side here that has a broken off branch or trunk,
That this
really kind
are
of
you
like
up here or down here?
nope, down low, about
Okay,
4 or 5 feet off the ground, maybe.
right
Yeah,
there.
that tree right there. So I see that one. And then I see that tree, that back trunk kind of splits into a Y down
Right
low,
here. Uh-huh.
and that right Y points across to another tree trunk.
Okay.
Yep. So you follow that tree trunk and then you skip over to the right Y of that tree trunk, and then it splits again, and then there you have your bird. So
Okay, so
sometimes I
you,
find figuring out what's that starting point. It may be a little ways off that you've got to guide people to, but if
uh-huh.
you can get people in their binoculars, they're only looking at a little bit of the ground or a bit of the area. Get them on a thing that they can really find that's unique.
Yeah, so a distinctive feature. That's a great point. That's a
Yeah.
great point. Okay, so another way you could describe getting there from that distinctive feature is to use the clock and say from the top of that, let's call it a snag or whatever, a broken trunk.
Yeah.
From the top of that, the bird's at 2 o'clock. And
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
might have to
Excellent.
say how far or whatever, but that's going to at least get you in the right direction. You could even use your other points to work over there. So the clock feature is kind of good. How about here? So here we
Oh
have this
gosh.
one tree, and just because it's one tree doesn't mean it's easy to find where you're looking. This one's got
For
branches all
sure.
over the place. Beautiful ponderosa pine down in Montezuma County. And we've
Yeah.
got a bird in this part of the tree down here marked by that red blob. So how would you get people on that?
Yeah, so we can't see the whole tree here in this photo, but I might say it's in the crown of the tree, or if I say like the top 5 feet of the tree, top 10 feet of the tree, I think different people see that differently and estimate heights differently. So that can be tricky to do. But this one is tricky, right? So I tend to start at like, okay, start at the top of the tree and let's think about how we can work our way down the tree to that point. So I would say it's on the left side of the tree, left side of the trunk.
That's
Let's
good.
start there. So we
That's
kind of
50% of
know,
the problem right
yeah,
there.
that's 50. We've got 50% of the problem there. And I see there's kind of a thicker branch up there in the crown
The
that's
biggest branch here, like this
I'm
one.
probably reversed, but I see that thick branch and it's below that thick branch. we take that thick branch and we go down a branch and then down another branch that's out
Okay.
on that left branch that's curving downwards.
Okay. Cool. You
Um,
got me there. That's good.
yeah, so that's kind of how I would try to steer people towards it. A lot of people maybe they don't see that thick branch, but um, you've got to kind of find weird little things that are unique
Yeah.
to,
And we can fall back on that clock pattern here again too. If we have
again,
a
yeah, it's fun.
tree, so we've got a clock, 12 is at the top. Here's I'm getting mixed 3 o'clock out here and 9 o'clock. So this, I would say it's in the, you could even say it's in the lower left portion of the crown, or you could say
Mhm.
it's down at about 7 o'clock. But then you'd have to kind of get people on how far in and all that. But that's a good way
Yeah, yeah.
too. So, cool, excellent. So that worked. Now we've got a group of trees
Oh
and
gosh.
all blending together, and birds up in the crown of one of them there.
Yeah. Yeah, so
I've got an idea right away myself, but
this is an interesting one where there's not a whole lot that like immediately jumps out visually as unique. I don't see a giant snag or something. Sometimes it'll be like a red bush or something like that that you can point towards. So for this one, imagining that I've got a group of people, they're all looking at it from a different angle. I would probably start them at, let's look at the tallest tree. We've got the
right on.
tallest tree because
Great.
that's easy enough to pick out.
And it's definitive too. There's only one tallest tree, so it's
Hopefully
not.
there's only one tallest tree. Um, and then I'm going to tell them, I want you to go to the tree to the left of it. And, from my vantage point, I see a little window of sky
This guy,
there
okay,
in the crown, and it's just to the left, and there's a dark Y branching, and I want you to look at that. Um,
great.
that's one that I imagine a lot of people, we'd get a few people on it that way, and then have to work. Maybe we start at the ground and work up trunks. That's another
And
strategy.
we can even employ our clock again here from the
Yeah,
tallest point and say it's like, 7:30 or 6:30. What is that? 7 o'clock down from the crown. So
yeah, yeah.
this was in real life a yellow warbler at Pastorius Reservoir in La Plata County.
Oh,
But
nice. I like that
cool.
place.
So all right, good job. So here we have our last image for this effort. And now we're in a
Oh
clump of
gosh,
forest
it's in the
and
tree.
we're near the San Juan River in Archuleta. And
Yeah, yeah. So this one is in the tree, right? Like, can't
yeah,
you
there
see
you go.
it? No, it's so I would start by, the road is a really good frame of reference.
Yes,
So
yes,
right side of the road, that's the first thing. And we say, it's up in the tree and to me it looks like it's eye height or maybe a little bit above eye level. So that's a good reference point. It's not, 40 feet up in the tree. It's down kind of low.
good.
Um, and then, I think I find that people kind of struggle with like if there's lots of trees, especially if we're looking at them at different angles, it can be hard to say that tree sometimes. So I'm always looking for what is unique on, in my sort of view plane. Is there a building or something like that? And for this one, I see that patch of snow.
Yeah,
And so I would say, like, it's on the right side of the road, there's a patch of snow, and it looks like there's a little deciduous tree. We're either looking at this
exactly.
deciduous tree or behind it, and then there's the big conifers behind that.
Right. So picking out the distinctive feature again, laying the groundwork, saying right of the road, and then the
Yeah.
distinctive features get you there. So that's great. Of course, what really happens when you're trying to describe where the bird is you end up saying, "Oh, it
Yeah,
just flew,"
exactly.
before
Now it's on
people
the
get
left
like,
side of the road and it's 40 feet up.
or is gone entirely, and the challenge is moot. So cool. So I think that's going to be the end of our little segment here, and we can now. I'm gonna Well, see, no, I have to go to my ending here. So thank you for that, Laura. You did a great job as usual. And I'd like to say thank you to the many photographers whose images were used for this presentation. Hopefully the images are all credited correctly on each slide. Couldn't do it without you. If you're interested in being a Bird Bombs photo contributor and you have photos on eBird, it's very easy for me to access them that way. You can just let me know that that's okay. And so our little Western tanager here is saying thank you and adios. And I'm looking forward already to the next Bird Bombs coming up in July 25th in about a month. This one will be Colorado Bird Taxonomy Made Simple. So this is about understanding a little bit about relationships of birds, and knowing how things are related will help inform not only our identification, but really our appreciation of the birds. So that's going to be a fun one. So tune in for that on July 25th. You can register already on the DFO webpage. Of course, we have our library of prior 26 and soon this 27th episode of Bird Bombs on the DFO page. Go to the programs and events page, scroll down a little bit, you'll see the Bird Bombs button. You can get to all of those to look at. So I'm going to stop my screen share, and then we can consider if we have any questions or comments.
Yeah, so again, if you have questions, please drop them in the Q&A and I'm happy to ask them. Our first question from Susan is, and I feel this one, why are females so drab and challenging?
Because, well, I gotta watch what I say here, so I'm not gonna say what it's gonna say. It's just the way it is with most of our songbirds, is that, is that the females, if there's a coloration difference between males and females in the species, the females are going to be drabber. And it's generally thought that, it's a little bit complex, but an interplay between the male's brighter coloration, signaling is fitness and attractiveness to the female for pairing purposes, and then also the female's drabber coloration being a little more camouflaged for hiding on nests. A lot of times the female may do a lot of the sitting on the nest, and that helps. But that's kind of one difference there. But it's actually something different that can be driving that coloration difference, and we can't get into it. But that's a common pattern with songbirds. Females are duller.
Yeah, yeah. So one thing that we didn't talk about in a ton of detail is where do we go look for these birds? And I know we covered a lot of birds in different different kind of, they have different habitats, but if you had to pick maybe two places to go see some of these birds, where would you go?
2 places. Oh my.
Maybe
Well,
three. I'll give you three.
so I'm going to talk a little bit more about habitat types, as I mentioned a couple spots, but areas that have foothill shrubland, and or the oak scrub, which here in my home area could be like Yerkes Canyon Park, um, Red Rocks area, getting up in your area. I don't know which parks up in, say, Boulder County would be kind of in the lower foothills. Those are really rich with some of these species. And then forest habitats. So a lot of these are forest-oriented birds, or like to have a tree component in the mix. And so any kind of situations where you're dealing with that. Now they all pick out their certain habitats. If you want a Western tanager, you're going to want to be where conifers are, whether it's Douglas firs or pines. If you want a lazuli bunting, then you're going to be looking for shrubby, some kind of a shrubby element. So habitat considerations are important. Now you won't find the blue grosbeak so much in the foothill edge as you will if you get out a little prairie-ward. So getting out somewhere like Rocky Mountain Arsenal National Wildlife Refuge is a good place to see a blue grosbeak out there where you're more grass kind of dominated area, still with some trees and shrubs and things around.
Yeah, nice. Yeah. I know here by me that there's like a Bear Creek trailhead at Shanahan Ridge is really good for lazuli buntings. I got it right.
That's bunting.
And sometimes there's an indigo bunting up at Chautauqua up here in Boulder. So
Right.
those are good places. A little bit a slight different topic, but I think it's our last question for the night. Judy asks about broad-tailed hummingbirds. It is summer and we've got the broad-tails hanging out. Do they ever nest in tree holes? Do you know?
No, hummingbirds always build a cup nest on somewhat of a horizontal situation, whether it's a little limb or even a man-made feature, like sometimes all kinds of different spots they'll pick out. But they build a cup nest on a horizontal situation. No hummers are cavity nesters. It might be kind of hard for them to navigate in and out of cavities if you think about it, but they don't do that. No.
Cool.
All
Awesome,
right.
David. Well, thank
That's
you.
it. So,
And we'll
all
see
right.
you next
Thanks.
month.
Great. Thanks, everyone. If you enjoyed Bird Bombs, let me know what you liked. I don't get a lot of specific feedback, and I do welcome that. It helps me going forward with ideas about what's clicking with people or not. So you can email me and let me know, because I always appreciate some feedback. And I'm looking forward to our next one coming up in a month, July 25th, Colorado Bird Taxonomy Made Simple. So I'll see you back then, and watch for the video of this one up on the DFO page, hopefully within a couple days. All right, good night, everybody.